Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our next installment of the AU Research webinar series, and thank you for joining us today. Please note that this session is being recorded and will be available on the AU Research Center website following this session. I've posted the link at the top of the chat box for your reference. Please hold your questions to the end of the presentation as we'll have time for Q&A. You may use your mic to ask the question or simply type your message in the chat box and we'll read it out so it can be recorded. Before we start this morning, I'd like to respectfully acknowledge that we are hosting this session today on the traditional lands of the Indigenous peoples, Inuit, First Nations, Métis of Canada. We honor the ancestry, heritage, and gifts of the Indigenous peoples and give thanks to them. Our presenter today is Dr. Andrew Perrin. Dr. Perrin is the AVP Research here at Athabasca University and scholar of Judaism and Christianity in antiquity. He is a former Canada Research Chair holder, Alexander von Humboldt Fellow, and Fellow of the Albright Institute of Archaeological Research. His work includes published monographs, edited volumes, journal articles, and public outreach in the area of Dead Sea Scrolls research. This morning, Andy will be presenting the ongoing history of recalculating apocalyptic time and recalibrating apocalyptic hopes. So without further ado, I'll turn the mic over to Andy.
Thanks for the introduction and invitation to be part of the webinar. I appreciate your time this afternoon on the heels of the holiday season. As I was prepping this lecture, I was reminded of a similar booking experience I had in the younger days. My first job right after graduating from my undergraduate was at the city of Calgary, and I worked for a youth employment center. And part of my job was giving workshops in high schools on resume writing, job searching, applying for university, these things. And I'll never forget, I was booked in for a Friday afternoon workshop with about 400 high school students the Friday before the Easter long weekend. And looking back, I know that was one of the more horrific presentation opportunities I've had. So thanks for taking part of your afternoon to have one last talk before the break. And I'm sure whatever questions we have will be less crazy than wrangling a few hundred 17-year-old kids in a gymnasium on a long weekend. So I'm sure we'll have some good discussion over this. And I've tried to prepare a talk that will get us into something and out of it relatively efficiently while giving a sense of a bigger context. I don't know about everybody on the call. As I learn more about the research on at AU, sometimes I feel like this, maybe you do as well, but I work within like a niche, within a niche, within a niche, within a niche. And what I want to try and do with this talk is get us in and out of there, but contextualize that niche, because I think as I look at my own work, I try not just to stay in my own disciplinary hole. I like to come out of that and try to connect to much broader projects. So I'll share a screen and drop a few items on the chat throughout the talk to contextualize things for us, which will hopefully also provide some visuals along the way. So the title of the talk here today is, as Jill said, the ongoing history of recalculating apocalyptic time and recalibrating apocalyptic hopes. But in fact, this is a presentation that is built out of a book project that I recently published or co-edited with a colleague of mine in Munich. The project is, in fact, a book project where I was a co-editor and had a few of my students as well involved in the enterprise of publishing the volume. But it's a very international, interdisciplinary, and collaborative project. So I'll try to present kind of the idea behind it, as well as some of the big picture outcomes, but maybe just zeroing in on my one contribution there in terms of Dead Sea Scrolls studies. So I've dropped the item in the chat there. The book is open access, so if you're behind on your Christmas shopping, by all means, print off a copy for a loved one and jam it in their stocking. The volume is published with Brill. It is, where are we going here? It's called the Four Kingdoms Motif, before and beyond the Book of Daniel. Now, there's a lot of technical pieces in the volume, even some technical pieces in the title itself. But really briefly, what we were trying to do was track how groups have understood themselves in relation to an unsettled present moment under empire, perhaps ongoing oppression in the past, and then looking at those experiences lived and perceived to try and chart a course for restoration and hope in the future. And really what we're talking about there is something called apocalyptic historiography. How do groups, writers, and these types of things order time and understand themselves in relation to time, as well as think about their expectations on the horizon. The thing that was most inspiring to me in this work, in this project of the last few years, was it started off in a niche of a niche of a niche, but we were able to build it out with some incredible contributions that really cut across time from antiquity to the medieval period, as well as a very broad set of cultural writings from Judaisms and Christianities, I should say, given the scope of time, as well as some Islamic traditions, African traditions from Ethiopia, even into things like architecture. It was really unexpected how far we were able to chase this theme. But if we were to try and look at what's going on behind all of this in the book project, I tried to look back and go, where did we start? The question that we were asking was something like this: how do readers, writers, communities, creatives even, how are they inspired by Daniel, the book of Daniel, Daniel's apocalyptic visions? I'll say more about that in a minute. Then how do they perceive and order to political shifts? And then more importantly, how they orient themselves to that timeline, as I said, accounting for unexpected realities in the present and projecting into the future. Now, surprise, surprise, there's no one answer to that question. We knew that going into it, so we were interested in seeing how many different types of answers we can collect as we study different historiographies in literature, culture, architecture, these types of things. Now, all of that is too much for a single talk over the lunch hour. So I will try to just give you some sound bites about key outcomes, as I said, with my piece in the middle. But since it's a bit of a cryptic area of study, and this is more of an open seminar, I thought I would try and take a different run at it by starting us off in a place that's a little closer to home, at least for us culturally, as well as some things you might recognize closer to our own day. So rather than fast forward or rewind rather to the ancient world, I want to start off in the year 1844, and more specifically on October 22nd of that year. And I want to introduce you to a Baptist preacher known as William Miller. Now, as academics, I think we're all used to celebrating our successes, but we also have our fair share of disappointments in our work. My sense is that few of us will go down in history as being known for having the great disappointment. So this is kind of Miller's biggest success, unfortunately. So who was Miller? What is this date, and why does it matter to this bigger project? William Miller, as you can see here, as I mentioned, was an American Baptist preacher. He was convinced and very strongly convicted that the world was about to end. There are many reasons for this. If you think about American history and European history in this time, things like the French Revolution, the American Revolution was still very fresh in cultural memory. And preachers like Miller, I guess we could say, they overlaid that experience with, what we could call an emerging Christian thought around apocalyptic expectations. And the result of that was this expectation of the imminent arrival of divine rule, deliverance, and all that came with that, peace, prosperity, the politics. And you can sense here, we're already getting the moorings of kind of like an American dream that weds into a utopian outlook that kind of is fed by these apocalyptic hopes that we see very alive and well in different places, particularly in American fundamentalist evangelicalism. So we can see that taking root here in some ways already. Now, Miller was so confident in that this imminent overturn of the ages that he actually calculated the date it would transpire. As I said, that's how we got to October 22nd, 1844. So why this date, and what was the data that led to it? The tragic reality is Christian apocalyptic movements, particularly modern ones, especially again in an American context. So this is also perking up in broader international context, for example, from the QAnon movement. They typically will find their inspiration in cryptic and imaginative books of the Christian or Jewish Bibles. And the most cryptic and imaginative is the book of Revelation. If you've ever read Revelation, you'll know why. If you haven't, just Google it and you'll see what I mean. Now, that type of inspiration can have really tragic ends. In very recent cultural memory still, things like the Branch Davidian movement in the early 1990s, led by David Koresh. He was known to be very deeply inspired by a unsettling reading of Revelation. We can also see a different type of tragic outcomes, I would argue, like the travesty of selling 80 billion copies of the Left Behind book series that turned into at least 2 terrible movies, one of them featuring a terrible actor that we see here, Nicolas Cage. But that's just my own inclination on where misguided apocalyptic hopes could land. So how do you get there? We've got movements, we've got hopes, dashed hopes, 80 million books, and in one case, severe loss of life. But Revelation, the book of Revelation, is really inspiring these types of movements, but it only gets us part of the way there, because you can't get to Waco and David Koresh, you can't get to Left Behind, and William Miller couldn't get to his date on Revelation alone. They needed to go deeper still, because underneath the hood of all of that is a deeper, older, more impacting apocalyptic tradition from the ancient world that we find in both the Hebrew Bible as well as in the Christian Old Testament. That's the book of Daniel. The book of Daniel, again, if you've read this, you might have a sense of what these scenes are depicting. If not, you can get a sense of this even just really quickly by perusing the book or Googling some sound bites of it. Daniel is a book of a court tale of a Jew in the Babylonian court. It's shot through with apocalyptic dreams. Daniel has dreams as a Jewish courtier. The Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar has dreams. There's a number of stories throughout that are kind of wet alongside those. But in those dreams, they all relate to that sage or that monarch learning of the course or configuration of history, typically using a motif of 4 elements or 4 phases of empires. So, for example, in Daniel 2, we have a dream of a 4-tiered statue of metals, 4 different metals. In Daniel 7, Nebuchadnezzar dreams of these 4 hybrid mythical beasts emerging out of chaotic waters. Now, tucked in between those dreams and those chapters, we then have divine interpretations that are given to those stories. We learn that that's not just a statue and those are just beasts. That number of 4 is meant to symbolize empires that will rise and fall towards what they're hoping will be some sort of utopian age. So you can see here where we're starting to get closer to things like Waco, Left Behind, and even William Miller. So to bring it back to our Baptist preacher, why did this all matter to Miller, and how did he land at that date? Well, as you can see here from this, in a way beautiful, in a way tragic chart, Miller looked at writings like the book of Daniel specifically, and understood the ordering of empires that it spoke of in that book as not just about the ancient world, but about perceiving patterns of history that were not just symbolic, but really symptomatic of present events towards an imminent age. Now, if we look at this item here, you can see on the top left, this is that statue from Daniel 2. It's naming ancient empires, Babylon, Media, Persia, Greece, pagan Rome, perhaps. The 10 kingdoms relates to something from Daniel 7. But what's interesting here is you can see then that symbolism mapped out into different ways, with some really running the numbers on dates down through different understandings of Rome till all the way down to the bottom, where we get the kind of sum total of the calculation in the year 1843. Now, we see how this can kind of lead in that direction, but if you've been listening closely, you'll see that we're at 1843, but the date we started off with was October 12th, or 22nd rather, 1844. So there's a disconnect there. There's a whole other story we could tell about this, but to kind of make a long story short, the end of the world, surprise, surprise, never seems to come on time. Miller and his followers originally charted a date in 1843. It didn't happen, and they actually had a few different recalculations. Every time an apocalyptic movement runs the numbers on the end of the world, somehow the sun always rises, tomorrow always comes, and whether you quit your job or did something more tragic and there's a loss of life, culture, time, history moves on. So if that's kind of the background that we could be thinking of here for this larger project and this larger talk, I want to kind of bridge out of those kind of more recent examples to kind of capture this idea of recalibrating and rethinking apocalyptic time by looking at, or by thinking about a few kind of takeaways, the things to kind of help us bridge from then into this project. When we look at that Four Kingdoms motif, I think we could see that there's a number of things going on there, but I'll try to highlight some that I think are important for us to help now going back further in time and understanding other apocalyptic movements. One is that motif is very much time bound in the sense that whenever it was written in Daniel in the 2nd century, it was meant to inspire hope under a specific historical situation. And we'll say more about that in a minute. But as time goes on, that motif becomes very timely because it's symbolic and cryptic and somewhat ambiguous. So readers and communities that eventually have Daniel in their Jewish and Christian scriptures, they can look at that motif as a tool for recreating, crafting, reimagining new expectations under different ongoing oppressive political realities. And then finally, in a way, it's also timeless because the end never materializes as planned, not just in the 2nd century, not just in 1843, but in very much even in contemporary movements. So that motif is very much open-ended to some inherent recalibration. It's in a very effective way of keeping hope and deliverance on the horizon, even in light of an ongoing confusion about why things didn't transpire the way that we thought. So our book project and that collaboration really tried to park at that intersection of this time-bound, timeless, and timely motif, using Daniel as the vehicle then to go into a number of different directions in culture and communities and different corporate writings to see how they defined or redefined their identities and then refined their expectations when the end didn't come as planned. So what I'll shift gears now. That's kind of my already too long of an introduction from the great disappointment into what are the opportunities that we could see here for us in our project. So I'll focus in on my sample contribution in light of some work in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and then contextualize a few other outcomes that were surprising and new to me at least. So if we're going to start with Dead Sea Scrolls, we're going to go back and kind of think about Daniel. There's a few things we need to know. When the book of Daniel was written, or at least came together in the 2nd century BCE, it was a season of really, you could say, unprecedented affliction for several Jewish groups living in Judea. And Judea is an ancient term, kind of we could use the term Palestine, ancient Palestine. More or less, we're talking about the what we see the state of Israel today, but in a much smaller term or a much smaller space back then. As you may know, right now we're kind of in the holiday season. So part of that holiday season is Hanukkah, and that marks the reclaiming and recleansing of the temple by a group of Jewish rebels known as the Maccabees in the year 164. Now, they were eventually successful enough in their tactics of pushing back against the Hellenistic Empire that they actually had a brief period of independence where they had this island of a short-lived dynasty in this larger Greek empire. The Hellenistic Empire then was massive on ancient world scale, with Alexander the Great pushing from Macedonia in the west all the way across to the Indus River. So it was huge scale, and we have this moment in Judea where there's a face-off and a momentary success against Jews pushing back against the empire. Now, in many ways, those tensions that we see under Antiochus and those tensions that we see in Judea in the 2nd century are the backdrop of really the sorts of political oppression and the boiling of hopes for deliverance that we find in the book of Daniel. Now, Daniel, the prophecies in Daniel are concerned not only with one empire, but as we saw from even the illuminated manuscript samples I showed a minute ago, or William Miller's outline theory, they're concerned with critiquing the very idea of empire and then tracking empire's demises down through the centuries. So when Daniel dreams of that 4-tiered statue in Daniel 2, or Nebuchadnezzar beholds those 4 horrific beasts, these are symbols, they're stand-ins for 4 ancient empires, probably Babylon, Persia, Media, and Greece. And that sequence we'll come back to in a minute. But as we saw later on with Miller, the rhetoric is pretty simple, but it's also clever because it's making the point that the problems with empire are persistent. And for whatever group and whatever cultural moment, they're always in that moment of the worst of the worst of the worst, where deliverance is just around the corner. So for those ancient Jews, that thumb was the Hellenistic Empire. Same for the book of Daniel. And that inspired the hope that Greece's time as a superpower was almost up. Divine rule is just around the corner. But if you are a historian on the call, and you know kind of your succession of empires at this part of the world and this point in history, the problem is Greece may have kind of gone away, but then Rome showed up and became the dominant superpower in this space of the world and expanded from there. So there we have a key moment, one of the earliest key moments where this type of counting four kingdoms to find hope and assurance of deliverance is around the corner, where that reality, that expectation was shattered. So what do you do if you're the writers of Daniel? What do you do if you're an ancient Jewish group who's believing that was going to happen? Does that make the prophecy wrong? Are your hopes dashed? Do you just go away? Well, yes and no. But one of the places we see recalibration and kind of going back to the drawing board is in fact in the Dead Sea Scrolls. This could be a whole other topic of a lecture, so I'll try to overview what these are, just a few kind of bullet points. One of the earliest places we see that recalibration, that shifting of timelines, rethinking expectations, is in a writing in Aramaic in the scrolls. Now, the Dead Sea Scrolls are a relatively modern discovery. They were found about 75 years ago on the northwest corner of the Dead Sea. They were found in caves, about 11 caves. I say about 11 because it seems like there are more caves that we're just learning about in the last year or two. I'll drop a YouTube clip in the chat. While it's usually terrible pedagogy to ask people to watch YouTube in the middle of your talk, I think it makes sense here. There's a drone flyover of the area. It's the lowest point on Earth. It looks like you're somewhere in a Star Wars movie, and you'll see the archaeological settlement of the Jewish group of scribes who penned or preserved these manuscripts and then tucked them away in the caves. Now, this group didn't like the Romans. They were a group that was a group of priests who were angry with the Jerusalem temple, who didn't like the empire, and they retreated out of the wilderness to prepare what they understood as kind of paving the way forward for the divine rule of God. These manuscripts are often very fragmentary, and I'll drop another link in the chat for a digitization project where you can view most of the scrolls online in really high quality photographs. And there you'll see that most often we're not talking about Dead Sea Scrolls, we're talking about Dead Sea scraps. The materials that I deal in are much smaller and more fragmentary, which is frustrating at times. But based on those fragments, even we can see that there are several writings that this group or like-minded groups are embracing that type of apocalyptic thinking. Empire's terrible. We're on the cusp of something big. Daniel might have been wrong. Now we need to rethink it. That's one of the earliest places we find this type of thinking. And I want to walk through one sample of that in a writing in Aramaic that is conveniently known as the Aramaic Four Kingdoms. And you see a fragment of Daniel here on the screen, as well as one of the caves. If you didn't look at the YouTube video, this is cave 4. It's about a stone's throw away from the archaeological site of this community group. And that's where this manuscript that we'll look at in a moment was actually was discovered. So what is the Four Kingdoms? What is this Four Kingdoms text? I've got the images here for you, infrared images, as well as full color. So you can see why infrared technology is so helpful and really necessary. You can't read much without the naked eye, or which is the naked eye. On this fragment written in Aramaic, I just got a soundbite here, a sample of it, to try and capture some of the Four Kingdoms type of thinking that we see in this text, written probably slightly after Daniel. It's a dream vision text, again, a story about an ancient Jewish dreamer or dream interpreter. He says this, and it's very fragmentary. So anytime we have an ellipsis like this here or here, it's because we have gaps, for example, here and here. The seer says this: the dawn arose, and there were 4 trees, and these trees were saying to him, and one of the trees stood up, and they went far from him, and they said, this is the image. And I said, where may I look and understand it? And then it says, and there's a tree that asked, and I asked, what is your name? And he said, the tree said to me, Babylon. And I looked at it and said, you are him who rules in Persia. And then I saw another tree and I looked to the west. So he's looking now towards the west, probably towards the Mediterranean, toward torment. And I asked it, what is your name? And we don't have the name, but it's interesting. It says this. And the tree said to me, or you are him. And the seer says, with vigor of the sea and you rule over all the harbors of the sea peoples. So probably talking about a seafaring peoples that has an empire. And then the third tree, everything is lost and we don't know what the context or name of the tree was. So if we were just to kind of stand back from that text and think about what we've learned a little bit about from the book of Daniel in our brief flyover, if we compare the lists that we know are the references for the empires of Daniel, it would run like this: Babylon, Media, Persia, Greece. But this other new text we just learned about now, this Four Kingdoms text we see below, did something clever. This text is written under Roman rule. This text is written at a time when the writer knows that the kingdom of God didn't show up as Daniel thought, hoped, expected. And unlike, like some dystopian Orwellian math from 1984, 2 + 2 can't equal 5. This has to be a four-kingdom count. That's what the scribe felt very strongly about. So what he did was consolidate Babylon and Persia into one hybrid empire. Basically, they're the imperial foe over there in the east. Babylon, Persia, one and the same. They're just the bad guys over there. And by doing that, he bought himself a slot in this Four Kingdoms scheme. He could bump Greece back. He could then include Rome, and then could put the fourth kingdom as the pinnacle of history, with divine rule being right on the horizon. Now, there's a whole lot of other things that are going on in this text, but what I want to zero in on here is this is the first time we know about in ancient Jewish culture where we have an apocalyptic movement, or a scribe in this case, going back to the drawing board, recalibrating the timeline, and rethinking their apocalyptic hopes to make sense of a new reality. We saw that with William Miller, but one of the things that was really brilliant in terms of the conversations we had for a project in the volume that I presented earlier was we didn't know how much activity there was around that kind of rethinking apocalyptic history down through the ages in between, say, the Dead Sea Scrolls and William Miller. So that was the project. We had 13 essays that took this in a number of different directions. Some of them that stood out to me were ones I didn't even know about. So I kind of want to highlight those for us here. The example that I want to just look at is from a colleague of mine named James Hamrick, who's a doctoral student actually at LMU in Munich. And his research is around Ethiopic commentary traditions, native Ethiopic commentary traditions in North Africa that are a little known but really important branch of Eastern Orthodoxy. And he studied the symbolism of Daniel in these traditions to see how Ethiopic commentators would decode this really confusing book to make sense of new political realities. What we see here in this sample of a translation from an Ethiopic codex that he studied or presented to our group was that we're not only talking about, the usual suspects, Alexander and the king of the Greeks. He's talking about, for this commentator, he says, this is what Hippolytus, who's another early Christian commentator, remarked, that these are the kings of Arabia who come from the seed of Kedar, son of Ishmael, who appear in the world until the coming of the Antichrist. What's interesting here now is we're starting to see a longer trajectory for a much later commentary who's still looking at the book of Daniel, still seeing it as key for hope on the horizon, but has to, in this context, in a North African context, account for not just the rise of Rome as a Western power, but now this ongoing and rising tide of Eastern powers with Islamic empires starting to kind of rise and reach across the Mediterranean. We also see this happen in some surprising ways, not just in the from the East, but in understandings in the West. A colleague of mine at Concordia University in Montreal, Lorenzo di Tomaso, studies medieval apocalyptic literature, so much later and now from a very different cultural context. What he brought to our attention is we see a spike in apocalyptic writings in the medieval period in the name of Daniel, and that quite often that Four Kingdoms motif was still alive and well. But as you can see from the quote here, it's not to say that Rome was this foe that we need to get over and forget about and hope for something better. In the rule of Charlemagne, for example, we see this understanding that the idea of empire has been translated into a Holy Roman Empire. So all of a sudden, Rome is not a foe. Rome is Christianized. And now these Christian rulers in continental Europe and beyond can claim themselves to be the heirs of that imperial heritage in a positive light. And we see this happen in a number of different ways. For example, not even limited to the remote past or medieval period, but the Third Reich in Nazi Germany is the same thing. It's the Third Reich is the Third Holy Roman German Empire. So that ongoing translation of empires plays out in some very tragic ways, even in our own recent history. The last item I want to bring to our attention for those of us that are interested in material culture, not just dusty texts as I am, this one was completely unknown to me, and a colleague of mine, Brennan Breed, brought this to our attention in the group. The Hereford map from around 1300. It's a massive medieval map where we see the cartography of the world. As we know, maps are never without bias and without their understanding or without their perspective. Here we have a key way where the Four Kingdoms motif is meant to show the culmination of empire. We have spiritual Jerusalem at the center, but if we go from east to west, which would be this way in this orientation of the map, we would see the Four Kingdoms. Babylon is somewhere up here, and Persia, Greece, with the British Isles culminating here. That orientation and that understanding of these four kingdoms is culminating towards this kind of understanding of English rule as being the quintessential empire is really key to this medieval period of medieval thought. If we were to look closer on this map, we'd see Christ enthroned on top. So again, that idea of a Christian empire, and an inscription about some of the sources that were used in the making of this map. And if you do your homework and dig back to those sources, they too are informed by that Four Kingdoms motif. So that's a bit of a flyover in terms of this project, but where I'd like to at least kind of draw my talk to a close and hopefully open up for some discussion on anything and everything that came to mind as you heard some of this research. Since we've got four kingdoms, I thought I would give us four things to take away. I think on the surface, this motif seems fixed. Like, how many ways can you count to four? It's very rigid. But as you see from these examples, when it's in the hands and minds of apocalyptic historiographers, it's in fact incredibly elastic, very flexible. The second piece is that I think most research in religious studies, particularly biblical studies, is biased towards origins. We want to know, where does something start? And then that's the answer to the question of what a text means. So to understand Daniel, we have to understand Daniel's day. Now, that historical homework is essential and valuable. What we try to capture in this project was the ongoing nature of that motif. It doesn't just end in the ancient world. In fact, it only starts there and is a much richer cultural heritage that extends forward. The third piece, to kind of circle back to where we started, is that modern apocalyptic movements are not only heir to books like Daniel and Revelation, they're actually heir to this whole way of thinking about time and history and their place and orientation to it. So we saw that, for example, in the idea of Rome. Rome could be translated to a Christian empire. Rome could be something that's now tucked in the mix in between ancient rules and Muslim rules. Rome could be many things, but it gets folded into a way of thinking that goes beyond the biblical books that might have inspired this type of thought on its own. Then the last thing, in a more kind of general way, I think this project shows the evolution of apocalyptic thought, particularly in times of loss and chaos and confusion. And for all the varieties and at times dangers that that type of thought can have, apocalyptic movements are generally about trying to capture some hope out of chaos. Now, that hope can be still misguided, as we could see, for example, in the examples of David Koresh, or in the understanding of the Third Reich as a new empire. It can be misguided and have tragic ends. But it's interesting to see also, there's a flip side, that at times this apocalyptic hope that people are holding on to in moments of chaos and loss is a way of projecting something of a healthier, better future for the community, for the culture. So as we look back on this, as I look back on this project, it started off again with a niche of a niche of a niche, and we kind of built out and in many ways brought together other people whose work was arguably as niche and specific, but tried to capture something of a larger history that's relevant, I think, to a number of cultures and communities down throughout history into our own contemporary context. So with that, I'll thank you for listening, and would invite any kind of questions or conversation that results from the presentation. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Andy. So now the floor is open for questions, so feel free to use your mic or the chat box to comment or ask those questions. And we do have the raise your hand feature as well, so the floor is open.
Thanks, Mina. I see there's a item in the chat box there. Sorry, Jill, did you want to read, or I can moderate? What's best?
You can read it out if you like, Andy.
Okay. Yeah, Mina, thank you. It says the reference to Alexander made me think that they were aware of the empires to the east of Arabia and Persia. I'm thinking of the Mauryan and the Gupta empires, but also the Sino empires, especially since Ethiopia was a strategic juncture between east and west in terms of spice and silk route. Did you encounter any reference to those? Good question. The projects that or the contributions that we had in the project, I should say, one of the surprising pieces that or for me, again, just kind of thinking of, kind of forces us out of our interdisciplinary bounds, was there was far more engagement with Islamic traditions and an awareness of the rise and then kind of tensions between East and West as it relates to Islamic rules in different regions in the area. We didn't see anything go further east than that, either historically or geographically. Generally, what we see in these types of traditions, for the Dead Sea Scrolls, for example, the reception history of these writings mostly pushes towards the West, with Judaism and Christianity in different ways receiving aspects of the tradition. But there is one text that eventually makes its way across the Near East and lands in a different form, a slightly different form in northwestern China at a site called Turfan, which was in where I'm understanding where the Persian and kind of Chinese dynasties had this space where they bumped up against each other and overlapped. And that text would also be written in Aramaic, so coming out of a similar scribal milieu. But in terms of awareness of other empires, the orientation here was mostly looking to the West until we have this now rise of Islamic traditions coming further from the East. One place that was also interesting was to see where this was a motif that was not just speaking, trying to speak against or redefine understandings. One of our contributors, Miriam Hjelm, who's a Swedish scholar, she studies Arabic translations, early Arabic translations of the Hebrew Bible, but also looks at Quranic interpretations that reflect the Hebrew Bible. There's a lot of references that are common between the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, and the Quran. And in one place, she uncovered where an Arabic Bible translator was saying, look, the fourth kingdom is the bad guys over there. There's Islamic rulers coming up. But then on the other side, within Islamic tradition, they said, look, Daniel was actually talking about we're the fourth empire and we've arrived. So it's interesting to see some of that cross conversation happening, but nothing in terms of the empires that you're mentioning here, at least as far as we went in the project. But thank you for the question. Very good. I see the chat bubbling away and a hand from Scott. So maybe I'll take the hand from Scott. And presumably this will be about water quality in the Dead Sea, which is horrific.
Thanks, Andy. Thanks very much for that talk. It's really quite interesting. So no questions about water quality in the Dead Sea, but I'm wondering, from a more general perspective, from this work, what do you envision some future research priorities being, both from a sort of broad discipline research priorities, but also, more so from like a personal interest research pathway that you see moving forward from here?
Good questions. In terms of kind of the disciplinary piece, one of the things we're really intentionally pushing back against is this bias towards origins. Generally, the academic study, biblical studies, again, not for kind of theological purposes, but like a historical cultural study, it really has that bias towards historical criticism. If we can reconstruct and rethink and understand the second century, then that's our job. That's really what my training is, and that's so important because that's your departure point. But in the last, I would say, 8 or 10 years, there's been a much greater awareness of what's called reception history, that even though these texts are ancient, they don't just stay in the ancient world. So if we don't account for, the thousands of years and varieties of ways these texts are used, then we really can't understand cultural heritage. We can't understand interreligious dialogue. We can't understand how it is that, scriptural texts can get used and misused. And, one of the ways I think we see this dovetail with apocalyptic thought in literature in a really unsettling and unhelpful way is, frankly, recent American politics. What does it mean that, to be blunt, why did so many people get excited about Trump moving the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem? It's because of an apocalyptic hope that somehow that's shifting our orientation to the end of the world or a Christian nation or something like that. And that really has a lot of, in some ways, unsettling thinking that goes along with that in terms of a certain brand of fundamental Christianity that's alive and well, I think, south of the border. Projects like this, I think, help us at least understand, I'm not saying to agree with that type of fundamentalism by any stretch, but it helps us understand that in a way what they're doing is part of what religious traditions and communities do. They try and make sense of their own day based on a somewhat helpful, perhaps, or some ways problematic reading of texts. So when I look at something like that and think about American politics as it's very much intimately related to evangelical Christianity south of the border, it's a similar study. We could have had a chapter on that in this because there's that's an apocalyptic movement at its roots. One example we didn't give here that we could have touched on is Billy Graham. That's really, I think that would be kind of a key figure in kind of the modern development of American evangelicalism. He did the same thing as William Miller, pinpointed a day, used the four kingdoms and said, this is the day it's all going to happen. The day didn't happen. So he, reran the numbers. And then eventually they kind of grew into a movement that said, well, the day will come. It doesn't matter when. That's the same thing we're seeing happen in the medieval period. That's the same thing we're seeing happening in some of these Ethiopic traditions. The outcomes are different, but I think it helps us understand that cultural need to find and make meaning and identity. So disciplinary, trying to remind people that we are historically rooted, but that's not it. But culturally, I think it's a way of maybe opening up some of those discussions and trying to understand the religious other, whoever that is, and how their thinking maybe takes shape in kind of a larger trajectory.
Oh, excellent. Yeah. So it sounds like, a little bit of sort of contemporary context might be in the future in terms of some of the history that you are learning so much and telling us about.
Yeah, that's why I think the interdisciplinary piece is so critical, because a few of the people we have working the volume are work really from Enlightenment period forward. And that, I think, was where it was really cool to see how we can all come together and try to get that arc of a tradition that nobody on their own could really develop.
Excellent. Well, yeah, thanks very much, Andy.
Thanks, Scott. I see in the chat a few items here. Lee, do you know if there are current manifestations of apocalyptic movements in Ethiopia today? The whole area of Ethiopic Christianity in the Orthodox tradition is incredibly understudied. There are a few places, universities in the world that really lead in this, with Munich being one of them, Oregon being another. U of T a little bit now as well is leading in this area. One of the challenges that university researchers have faced in engaging Ethiopic Christianity is the effects of colonialism. You have a group of white scholars showing up and saying, we'd love to look at your books and learn about you. And it's only been a few groups, particularly this group we were working with in Munich, that have been successful in doing that research, which is very much from the ground up with communities rather than pillaging and taking materials and then studying it at home. In terms of Ethiopic Christianity's scriptures and theology, they're also a very exciting space to explore because they don't have the same framework of a Bible as a fixed and formalized book of a limited set of writings. Ethiopic scribal still has a scribal tradition, and a Christian tradition that is much more open and diverse to traditions and writings that are generally from the ancient and medieval period that have a relevance to their religious identity and life, but they're not limited in saying it has to be only Daniel or Revelation. There's a number of other texts that we know about that are part of their formative way of understanding the world, which means that they're able to draw on a larger, in some ways, unknown cultural heritage to the West in understanding how they view the world. One example of this would be there's a lot of potential there because of their apocalyptic texts and other traditions in their theologies of ecology. How is it that religious tradition frames the way they view the natural world and relate to it? Is a totally different framework because they're not limited to the same set of books that we have in, say, the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament. So there's a lot more diversity there, but it's something I would say that's only recently coming onto the fore in research in religious studies, how to responsibly not just engage, but collaborate with this tradition that has sometimes been marginalized or taken advantage of due to colonialism. So thank you for the question. Yeah, a huge one to be interested to think more about. I saw a few here as well, trying to go back in the chat. Minel, you said, in terms of future contemporary interpretation of this research, I was wondering if it would be useful to rectify the origins bias by broadening the canvas to highlight what else was going on in other parts of the world. I think this bias serves evangelicals well, and it might be useful to contextualize this in a more global way. Completely agree. And I think the idea for our project was using something that we could have as a common departure point, but then not limiting where we could go with it. And like any interdisciplinary project, at least in my experience, you're very happy with the amount of ground you've uncovered, but then you suddenly have a very real sense that there's so much more ground that you didn't uncover. So I think this is the type of work we kind of designed out of a guild in religious studies and biblical studies. But there could be a way of bringing this much further afield if we had the opportunity to kind of scale it out. And I think we started to kind of push on some of those directions, but had a sense that there's definitely more work to be done if we want to grow that out. So I think that's kind of the encouraging and unsettling part about this interdisciplinary work is you compound your collective intelligence, but then you compound what you don't know at the same time. So I think there's a way there. I don't have a great answer of what that could look like, but a possibility. Anita, I see a comment here as well, a question as well. How does the supposed spectacularity of apocalypses as an always deferred future universal event cover over the histories of apocalypse, pandemics, and times that have already occurred as long histories? I'm trying to hear the question, so let me read it again. Maybe if you wouldn't mind clarifying, I think I did a question, but I don't want to just answer without asking for the clarification.
Yeah, I thought I'd turn on the screen, Andy. Sorry about that. Might be too bundled. Thanks. Yeah, I was thinking just of apocalypse, and because you brought it in, it's somewhat beyond the scope of what you're looking at, but because you brought it into the contemporary in terms of Trumpian politics, thinking in terms of like Kyle Powis White's work on histories of apocalypse that have happened since contact, and what the whole notion of apocalypse does in terms of, noting transatlantic slavery, the long histories of such, like Yusuf's work on 1 billion black Anthropocenes or none, so that this always deferred notion of apocalypse as happening at this big scale, but from a very perspective, sort of leaves out certain ongoing versions of this.
Yeah, no, thanks, Anita, for clarifying. one of the things I had in my notes but didn't quite get to for time, I think that idea of like posture and perspective and privilege as well really dictates how dictates the formation and maintenance of identity, but that's almost always done by constructing or perceiving an other. And then that's the space where, the example of, having an Islamic interpreter and a North African interpreter, Christian interpreter, both using the same text, but then using it to point a finger at the other, was an interesting, example of where we see something along the lines where you're getting at maybe happening, because this is very much an ongoing piece. It's not that there's only one authority who's able to say, here's what we think about the end. Quite often it's multiple and manifest and pointing in many different directions. When it comes to more modern context as well, I think we have a number of other things that have impacted our understanding of time, history, and identity. Colonialism being a massive one, and that's an interesting piece for the Ethiopic tradition as well, as I mentioned. But also other world conflicts, and now a pandemic that's shaping how we understand the world around us. When we hear the word apocalypse in our own day, it's really loaded with images that are post-Cold War images, apocalyptic wastelands. There's race that also plays into this as well. There's colonialism playing this, and now there's a pandemic. So there's a real clouding in some ways of what we even mean by that. But part of that clouding, and it can be a positive one, because it then broadens how many other things are part of this kind of meaning making, whether it's for good or bad. So I think, when we use the apocalypse in religious studies, typically the starting point is we're talking about a genre of writing and a worldview. But as time goes on, the genre of writing kind of goes down, but the worldview amplifies. So the data set and what kind of gets put into that scope really does change. It's a very long non-answer to your good question, but to recognize that it does get more diverse and more complex, even though the body of literature that we may have started with kind of dwindles.
Thank you.
Thanks for your question. Oh, I made the mistake of not scrolling down. Here we go. Suzanne, does the apocalyptic vision, the book of Daniel, introduce or amplify a linear concept of time? In other words, was there less linear, perhaps more circular conception of time prior to that book in Judaism? Do linear conceptions of time tend to carry apocalyptic imaginaries? The whole area, great question. The whole area of how we understand time, and are there anachronisms when we read texts and we think of time from our Western culture, and what does that look like, is a whole area of I'd say recent active research in particularly in ancient Judaism, because time is not, the idea of linear time is not the only way of thinking about apocalyptic time. In fact, it might not be the best one. For example, the way I present this is we're counting 1, 2, 3, 4. But so in a way it is linear, but what these groups are doing is they're understanding patterns and cycles of time. And there's a cyclical piece where we find this in ancient Israelite thought as well as in early Jewish thought, that the history, if we use that term, is ominous. There's a way of interpreting historical events, individuals, empires, political reigns, in the same way that you would read an omen. And if you can understand that omen of time, then you can locate yourself in and understand where things are going. There are a number of other writings from ancient Judaism and beyond that start to do this, not just using like the 4 kingdoms piece we use here, but they use other patterns and cycles. 70 weeks of years would be one pattern cycle. And that would show up in the Dead Sea Scrolls, in Daniel, as well as in some other ancient Jewish writings that eventually show up in Ethiopia, that there's patterns of weeks or cycles of time. So in that sense, it's less about seeing a crescendo of time than it is understanding where you are in the kind of natural rhythm of this time and space. What also is interesting on that point is those are, we could say, the more kind of domestic internal understandings of time for emerging out of ancient Israel into early Judaism. But at this point in time, Judea is at once a Persian province and then kind of an island in this empire of Greece. So then we're getting conceptions of time coming in from the Hellenistic world that are also interacting with this type of thought. So it's, the easy way to look at this, or the simple way, is to introduce it as saying 1, 2, 3, 4, and then something happens. But I think it's much more three-dimensional kind of awareness of time, particular cycles, but perhaps also in some other ways, drawing on some of the cultural interactions with Hellenism. But that also, before I forget, one that comes to mind there as well, the example of the Hereford map in that same essay was brilliant. It talked about architecture, talked about cartography, but then the European understanding of time, when time becomes something that the state mandates. Like, I don't know about you, but whenever the time change happens, my cell phone gets told what time it is. We just take that for granted, but that's something that happens in continental Europe. Once city clocks are put in place, the state controls time. And if the state's understanding itself as empire, then empire controls time. So that whole area of time could go, again, in as many directions from the ancient world to medieval period. Really good question. Probably way more than we could capture in one essay, but definitely pointed in that direction.
Hey, thanks, Andy. We have a couple of minutes left for a question or two.
Thanks, Minal, for your comment about linear concept of aeons in Hinduism. I think if we were to chase this further, we'd see there's some pieces that relate to Persian religion, as we have some of these Aramaic traditions move further that way, but not quite as far as what you're touching on. Viv, thanks. Also picking up on this idea about phases of life on the earth in Hinduism, and thinking in a similar direction, perhaps.
Yeah, similar, but this is not actually a question. Sorry, Andy. This is just a comment. It brought back memories of stories I heard from my grandma along these lines. So thank you.
No, perfect. I'm glad to hear it's kind of sparking some ideas and memories that could connect elsewhere.
According to my grandma, the apocalypse would happen hundreds of thousands of years from now. So that was a huge comfort for the children in our group, but also raised plenty of questions as to, if God was going to come only at the end, what happens to all the bad people now? Are they going to continue to get worse? Anyway, it brought back memories. Thank you.
Yeah, well, and that's I think we could connect this with a much broader field of religious studies beyond. Again, our departure point for my guild was, or for my field was, ancient Judaism, Christianity, and going forward. But looking at apocalyptic literature in other world religions and movements, it goes in so many other different directions. In the spring, when I was teaching, I had an upper level undergraduate seminar on apocalyptic tradition, and we carved out the last third of the course to try and explore, even just very briefly, some of these other spaces, which was very interesting and relevant in light of the pandemic, when everybody was trying to ask, is the world ending again? To kind of broaden our perspective and go, what other traditions have engaged in this type of speculation? And there's a great book called Apocalypse. I think it's called Apocalypse Now or something like this, published by Fortress Press, that tried to do kind of what we did, only with using the title or term apocalypse, and spread a very broad net to see how far they could go in other religious traditions.
Thank you.
But thank you for the thought there, and I'm aware of the time, and I really appreciate the conversation over this work. This is something that was wrapping up towards the end of the last academic year, but it's been kind of on and off my desk for the last few months. So this is the first chance I've had to share it as a finished product, not just something in the works. So I appreciate your willingness to be part of the conversation and hear a bit about this research. And as I've met most of you on the call, I've so enjoyed talking over your research over the last number of months. So thanks for being gracious enough to do the same with me here. Thanks for your time.
Thank you for this thought-provoking presentation, Andy. And thank you all for joining us today. And with that, we'll see you at our next webinar in January. Bye for now.
Thanks, everyone. Happy holidays.
Happy holidays.